Hi, this is Brian Kim. I want to share with you case number 180 in the best way to do cataract surgery series. This is a 2 to 3 plus dense lens with a corneal scar and limited view. But you can see, despite having a more limited view, because I have mechanical fracturing techniques in my disposal, double chop, cross chop, and using tactile methods of being able to fracture the lens, even with limited view, I'm able to disassemble this lens confidently, safely, efficiently, utilizing mechanical fracturing forces and thereby decreasing ultrasonic energy and vacuum and getting clear corneas postoperatively in this case. And so you can see this patient has a dense scar. This patient had history of herpes corneal infection in the past. You can see this is a corneal marker which will help me to center and size Rexis, using the cotton tip to steady the eye and turn the eye towards the left. You can see this patient has a little bit of a resistance to my movements, but I use a cotton tip to help steady the eye so I can get a nice flat approach with my paracentesis incision, which allows me to achieve a self-sealing incision. This is intracameral lidocaine, and then some dispersive viscoelastic to coat the corneal endothelium and flatten the anterior capsule. And this is a triplanar corneal incision. I make a vertical groove, place the blade into the deep part of the groove, tunnel through the cornea, and then using the cannula, I turn the eye towards me, and then I enter. I use the cannula to control the eye without having to grab the eye, and this gives me excellent control with that maneuver. Push some more viscoelastic in. You can see these are not the Hydrodissection forceps. These are my old standard forceps that I was using before. You see I punctured the center, but you can see there's so much stria when I punctured the center with these forceps. Again, I don't use this anymore. I use a sharp tip forceps, which acts like a cystotome, which works so much better and doesn't cause any traction on the capsule when I push it down. Go around circumferentially. You can see it doesn't open up nearly as wide as the Hydrodissection when I try to grab and re-grab the Rexis flap here. Again, such a contrast to how I do it now. Again, this is a rather older case that I'm presenting here on this video. Finish off the Rexis, burp some viscoelastic out. This is the Capsulorhexis hydrodissection technique. I place a cannula under the Rexis edge contra-incisionally, point the tip down, get a nice wave decompress on the left side, sweeping, and then doing the same thing on the right side, and the lens begins to spin. Irrigating the surface of the eye, adjusting the sleeve, lifting the incision with the chopper, going in with irrigation off to minimize Descemet's trauma. Again, you can see some of that corneal haze. It's near my incisions and the instruments right there. And I'm about to get going, but then I realize, I didn't put any epinephrine in. So I go ahead and switch and push some epinephrine in to stabilize the pupil a little bit more, just in case it wants to come down. I switch back to my chopper, and then I go straight to it, leading off with the tip, go underneath the Rexis edge, turn it vertically, turning the phaco-tip vertically subincisionally, fracturing the lens completely in half. You saw how efficient that was. Placing the chopper under the right heminucleus, turning it vertically, pulling it centered toward the phaco-tip, fracturing the right heminucleus against the phaco-tip, acting like a chopping block. Lifting that first quadrant up with some vacuum, getting the chopper around it, crushing the lens between the instruments, breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens piece. You can feel the density of that lens piece. So again, going in half speed, doing the same thing, leading off with the tip, turning it vertically in the equator. The chopper is now vertical, turning the phaco-tip vertically subincisionally, bringing the instruments together centrally. There's no translational movement. There's no up and down movement. There are equal and opposing forces around the lens, and it fractures completely in half in that plane. Pronating my fingers and sliding the chopper underneath the right heminucleus, pulling it centered toward the phaco-tip, fracturing it against the stationary phaco-tip. Again, the phaco-tip is acting like a chopping block. Fractures that right heminucleus in half, using some vacuum to lift that first quadrant up, getting the chopper around it, crushing the lens between the instruments, using some vacuum again to crush the lens between the instruments once again, And once the lens pieces are small enough, using some ultrasonic energy to remove the lens pieces. Grabbing that one fragment there and then crushing it in half. Again, there's some pretty significant density to this lens. You can feel it every time you crush the lens into smaller pieces. Placing the chopper under the second quadrant, hooking the peripheral lens, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip, and then crushing that lens in half against the phaco tip. Again, the phaco tip's like a chopping block. Getting around the lens between the instruments, crushing the lens into smaller and smaller pieces, and then emulsifying the lens pieces using pulses of ultrasonic energy and vacuum. Grabbing that last fragment of the second quadrant, lifting it up with some vacuum, crushing it between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens piece. Rotating the second heminucleus in front of me, placing the chopper around the lens, pulling it centrally toward the phaco tip. By hooking the lens at the equatorial side, I'm able to hug the lens with opposing forces, and then crushing the lens by pulling the chopper towards the phaco tip and cutting the lens. Again, it's like cutting something with a knife against a chopping block. Crushing the lens between the instruments to make the pieces smaller once again, and then emulsifying the lens piece. Repeating this same maneuver, getting the chopper around the lens, crushing the lens between the instruments, and then emulsifying the lens piece. You can see how well controlled this is, very systematic, easy to do, and despite that corneal scar there, it is not really inhibiting what I'm having to do. I know where my instruments are, I know where my hand movements are, I know that I'm fully within the capsular bag when I'm doing the maneuvers, and I can confidently hook the peripheral lens with the chopper, positioning it at the level of the equator, making sure I'm within the capsular bag and never worrying that I'm around the capsular bag to damage the zonules. I have exquisite control by doing it this way, and I'm able to bring that lens toward the center and fracturing it against the phaco tip, which is held stationary in the middle, and the phaco tip again is acting like a chopping block. And I can chop in any direction. That's the beautiful versatility of this technique. The phaco tip is not engaging using ultrasonic energy or vacuum. It is simply a stationary cutting board or chopping block with those maneuvers. So the epinucleus has been removed. The chopper was placed deep in the capsular bag. So I take the chopper out, push BSS in, take the phaco tip out, and I go in with the INA handpiece. I always start subincisionally, removing the cortex from anterior to posterior, peeling off the cortex, and doing it this way, it peels off in a much more clean manner with less cortical wispy material that's left behind. Switching to polish mode, polishing underneath the rhexis edge of any lens epithelial cells. Polishing the posterior capsule as well. Polishing deep into the capsular fornix with the polymer tip in that low flow setting. This gives me a lot of confidence, and it makes sure that I don't have any remaining lens material that's in the capsule fornix. If you leave that stuff in there long term in the future, it can lead to a Summering's ring, chronic inflammation. You just don't want to leave a patient that way. Just get rid of all that stuff. You saw I polished into the subincisional capsule fornix with BSS to make sure there's nothing hiding subincisionally, filling the bag with cohesive viscoelastic, and then sweeping with the sweep. You can see again, this is an older case. I used my old forceps, and then this is the old sweep that I'm using here. It's funny how tiny and blunt that this sweeper looks like. The one I use now is again much bigger, and there's a sharper edge to the top. So as I sweep, it's much more effective in removing the lens epithelial cells. This is going to be a 3-piece lens, so I'll go ahead and widen the incision with the blade. Trying to wiggle the barrel into the incision, have the bevel facing to the left, deliver the leading haptic into the bag, roll the hand counterclockwise to let the optic come out flat, using the Maltzman to dial the trailing haptic into the capsular bag. Again, with these dense lenses, I am worried about zonulopathy, so I like to use 3-piece lenses here. Go in with irrigation off, activate irrigation, get underneath the lens, removing all the viscoelastic from within the bag. Repositing the optic, switching to polish mode, polishing underneath the rhexis edge, switching to visco mode, removing all the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber, and then I'll hydrate my incision. So again, this is a patient who has a corneal scar, but despite this corneal scar, it doesn't inhibit what I can see. And again, because this technique is not really based upon visualization, there's a lot of techniques that are handicapped by having to visualize every little step. Otherwise, it could be a dangerous situation. And one of the prime examples is when you're doing divide and conquer. If you can't see how deep you're sculpting, I mean, you're bringing that fingertip right against near the posterior capsule. There's not much left between you and that posterior capsule except a sliver of lens material. I've never really liked that technique. Of course, that's the way we're all taught. But this technique is much more easy. As long as I know how to place the chopper around the lens equator, which is easy because I push down on the lens material, and I know that the lens material is below the anterior capsulorhexis rim, I'm able to slide my instruments around the lens, fracture the lens completely in half, using mechanical fracturing forces to crush the lens pieces into smaller pieces, using sparing amounts of ultrasonic energy and pulses of it. Because I'm using mechanical forces, I have tremendous control of my instruments in my hands. I know exactly what I'm doing and where I am, and the risk of posterior capsule rupture and the risk for complications is much lower, even in the setting of a corneal scar when visibility may be compromised. And so this is why I feel like this is the best way to do cataract surgery. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.